On August 15, 2015, fast-rising diving star Guy Doc Deep Garman was attempting to break the diving depth world record during an attempted world record dive of 1,200 feet off St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands, when something went horrifyingly wrong. This is how it went down. Humans have always pushed themselves to do the impossible, to fly higher, to explore further, to dive deeper. We are driven by a need to discover and conquer. It is this instinct that has been behind some of the most amazing explorations and discoveries. It is what pushed us forward to a better understanding of our planet, of our body, and much more. And it will surely never stop. There will always be people trying to push further than before. People who are willing to bet their lives so that the rest of us may benefit from their discoveries. And deep diving is one of those extreme challenges where only a few dare to go. When it comes to deep diving, and I mean really deep diving, only the bravest of men attempt to cross the frontier. Diving to a depth of 300 meters or 1,000 feet is the holy grail of deep diving. In 2001, a diver named John Bennett first achieved this depth, and the same depth has been reached just a handful of times since. Less than 10 people are known to have dived below 240 meters or 800 feet, using a self-contained breathing apparatus on a recreational dive. In fact, more people have set foot on the moon than have reached the deepest scuba dive. And, as you will soon find out, this is for a very good reason. On September 18, 2014, in the Red Sea off the coast of Dahab, Egypt, Egyptian Navy Colonel Ahmed Gabr gingerly stretched and warmed up his muscles as he calmly prepared to make diving history. A quiet sea-town community off the coast of the Red Sea, Dahab was always a good place to get some relief from the sweltering desert heat. But Ahmed Gabr wasn't just looking to cool off with a dive today. At 41, Ahmed Gabr was already a well-known phenom in the diving world. He had begun his diving career at the age of 18, diving for pleasure, then later decided to get his diving instructor training. During his army years, he dove both for work and for pleasure, building and developing both his mental and physical abilities. And his military career no doubt played a huge role in shaping him to face what was going to be the deepest dive of his life. Before that day, Gabr already had about 9,000 dives under his belt, all leading up to this one, an attempt to reach 350 meters below sea level and beat the previous Guinness World Record for deep dive at 318.25 meters, set in 2005 by Nuno Gomez. Ahmed was well aware of the dangers and risks he faced on this dive, not least of which was the sheer depth itself. He was attempting a dive of over 1,000 feet, the height of the Eiffel Tower, the length of 3 football fields placed side by side, and so his first concern was the ability to withstand depth itself. Generally, the deeper a diver goes, the more risk grows of something going wrong. For starters, there's the possibility of being crushed by the sheer pressure of water depth. As a diver descends, the weight of the water above increases. Go deep enough, and the pressure of the water will squeeze anything not built to withstand those forces, like an empty water bottle. But the dangers aren't limited to external pressures alone. Internally, deep diving has a variety of potentially dangerous impacts on the human body. Unlike pressure at the depths, internal conditions can set in fast and with little warning. When you dive deep into the ocean, the pressure increases, and this affects how your body absorbs gases from the air you breathe. Nitrogen, a major part of the air in scuba tanks, can start to build up in your bloodstream faster than your body can handle. This buildup has a peculiar effect. It starts to act like a drug, making you feel sort of drunk. This strange feeling is called nitrogen narcosis. Imagine trying to think clearly and move properly when you're tipsy. Now, imagine that happening deep under the sea. It's not just a feeling of euphoria or slight confusion you might get from a few drinks. If nitrogen narcosis gets severe, you could start seeing things that aren't there, feel really dizzy, or even pass out. None of these are good news when you're surrounded by water and rely on your gear and wits to get back to the surface safely. To combat this, divers will use different gas mixtures the deeper they go, with less nitrogen than regular air. Another major risk to consider is decompression sickness. Decompression sickness, or the bends, occurs when all that nitrogen that was absorbed into soft tissue on descent floods its way back into the bloodstream too quickly and creates bubbles. Most cases of the bends are not serious, but it can cause death if it's severe enough. The best way to avoid this is by making something known as a decompression stop during the ascent. The number and duration of these stops are determined by how deep a diver goes and how long they stay at that depth, since these variables determine how much nitrogen gets absorbed by the body. By stopping at specific depths and remaining there for a set amount of time, the nitrogen is released slowly and doesn't form large bubbles that can be a problem. Strapped on Ahmed's back and filling his lungs were 5 tanks filled mostly with trimix, a blend of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium gases used for dives beyond 30 meters. The exact percentages of Gabr's trimix remain secret, as does his exact dive plan. 2 major technical components that were developed and refined by Gabr's expert team over months. 1 miscalculation, a single clinical error, the smallest margin of uncertainty, could mean Gabr's life. Gabr's strategy was straightforward, yet daring: to sidestep the dangers of narcosis and the crushing force of deep water pressure. He planned to descend swiftly to his maximum depth at an astonishing pace of nearly 30 meters per minute, about half a meter per second. His target was to reach the deepest point of his dive in roughly 12 minutes. And so, with a deep breath, and at 10:30 a.m., he was off. The first 10 or so minutes of Gabr's dive went perfectly according to plan. Support divers accompanied him until he reached the 50-meter mark, after which he carried on alone. The initial phase of his dive unfolded flawlessly. Guiding his path was a rope, meticulously tested and measured by a university in Cairo, and further validated by Guinness World Record official adjudicator Talal Omar, who had traveled from Dubai to verify and document this momentous event. Along the rope, depth markers were placed, leading down to an anchor at the bottom, specially designed and tested for this monumental dive. But at 290 meters deep, Gabr felt something. An unexplainable quiver ran through him. First a tremor, then an uncontrollable quiver broke out on his body, nearly taking him off course. There and then, he felt the first symptoms of another risk deep divers have to be wary about: high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. This problem, like narcosis, can come on fast and hit hard. HPNS starts deep underwater, below 150 meters. Especially with helium in the air divers breathe. It affects everyone differently, based on the helium amount, how deep they go, and how fast they get there. Discovered in the 1960s by a U.S. Navy scientist, HPNS is known for causing severe shaking called helium tremors. But it doesn't stop there. HPNS can also make you very sleepy, mess up your heart rate, and make it hard to think clearly. Each diver's battle with HPNS varies, shaped by their dive's depth, speed, and breathing mix. Facing deep danger, hallucinations, and possible muscular fatigue, Gabr did what his years of training taught him to do: remain calm and focus on the task at hand. At 290 meters deep, he was close to a key point. Despite the danger of HPNS hitting harder, with shaking, jerking, feeling super sleepy, sick, dizzy, seeing things wrong, and not thinking clearly, he pushed on. These symptoms could easily lead to a big mistake, but Gabr had to keep the pressure steady to stop them. His training and experience helped him stay in control underwater. But the most important thing for a deep diver is knowing when to stop and go back. At 332.35 meters, shaking and knowing his goal was just a bit further, but also thinking about the long 14 hours he had to come back up, Gabr made a big choice. He grabbed the depth tag at 332.35 meters, not reaching his full goal, but still going deeper than the last record by Nuno Gomez and beating the claimed but uncertified record of 330 meters set by French diver Pascal Bernab. Gabr surfaced from his dive 14 hours later at 12:20 a.m. on Friday morning, triumphant. He had made history with his scuba dive and in so doing, set a world record many diving fans and daredevils would inadvertently try to break. One of those inspired to try was Guy Doc Deep Garman, an ear, nose, and throat doctor from St. Croix, Marshall Islands. Garman, then in his mid-50s, decided to take on the challenge at Long Reach, a reef just outside Christiansted Harbor. He had backing of Scuba Tech, a tech diving school in St. Croix, known for pushing the limits of diving. Garman had been planning this dive for 2 years. His goal was to reach 365 meters, beating Gabr's record by over an entire 30 meters. His preparation was thorough, but the ocean, as always, held its own dangers. For his attempt, Garman, who called himself Dr. Deep, personally oversaw the installation of a dive line extending 1,300 feet into the ocean, anchored securely with a 250-pound weight. At this point, although Garman had only 600 dives to his name, he was diving far beyond the depths experienced by his trainers, who only had a maximum depth of 215 meters. This was the first of several red flags that would end in disaster. Garman didn't leave anything to chance. He planned every detail and knew more than even the dive experts who had trained him. Safety was his top priority. He had specific plans for all kinds of emergencies, like if he had a seizure underwater. For Garman, this dive was more than just an adventure. It was like a serious science experiment. Before the dive on August 15th, Garman had already done a deep dive to 248 meters all by himself, and everything went fine. He probably expected this dive to go smoothly too. For this dive, Garman was more than prepared, logistics-wise. He had 3 big tanks, 4 double tanks, 3 dive computers, and a GoPro camera. He also attached a special marker to his dive line. This marker was to show he really went down 365 meters, aiming for a world record. All his diving gear together weighed about 400 pounds. Imagine having the weight of 2 full-grown men on top of you, all while being underwater. Garman's diving plan, like Ahmed, was straightforward. He planned to dive down to 200 meters with his support team, using their tanks. Then, he would go alone to the full depth of 365 meters. After reaching his goal, he would come back up to the 200-meter mark. Here, his team would join him again for the incredibly long process of coming back to the surface safely. They planned to take their time, stopping every 10 feet. For this dive, besides Garman's 7 tanks, they had 28 more tanks ready for use. Garman's 20-year-old son, Kip, was part of the support team. His wife was also with him that day waiting on the boat. Together, they started their descent at 6 a.m. Garman was then supposed to meet the rest of his dive team 38 minutes later on his way up. They would take the necessary breaks during their ascent to make sure they came back to the surface safely. But as the minutes passed, there was no sign of Garman. He never appeared. Immediately, divers swam deeper into the ocean, hopefully looked to see a bubble, a sign, anything to indicate where Garman was, but they saw nothing but darkness. The hours dragged on, hope fading with each passing moment. There was no sign of Garman anywhere, and no indication of what happened to him in the depths of the ocean. The team faced the unbearable task of telling Garman's wife, Christy, and their son the grim news. Garman was gone, swallowed by the sea. 3 agonizing days later, Christy announced the recovery of Garman's body and gear. The Coast Guard inspected the equipment while the medical examiner worked to confirm what had happened to Guy Garman in those final horrifying moments. The dive planned by Garman, dubbed Dr. Deep, was filled with red flags from the start. Technical dive experts had warned him and Scuba Tech that the mission was extremely risky and predicted a tragic outcome. But despite these warnings, the dive went on planned. A week before the dive, Garman's team released a polished video on YouTube showcasing their preparation. Immediately, seasoned divers felt a sense of unease, labeling Garman as overly confident and his team as inexperienced. The video itself focused on achieving depth without proper support or gear for deep problems, and it screamed danger. After all, this was a depth length that had even claimed the life of legendary diver Shaq Exley. In the deep diving world, experience counts more than courage. Garman, with less than 600 dives and only 4 years of diving experience, was attempting something far beyond his skill level. His rapid progression in diving and the small number of deep dives he had completed were not enough for such an extreme record attempt. Moreover, Garman's dive planning was flawed. He relied on outdated methods without understanding the complexities of deep diving, such as the physics and physiology involved. In essence, while divers like Ahmed Gabr trained and planned for years and years, Garman, despite his scientific background, failed to do so, and he paid for it in the harshest way possible. Tragically, the dive ended as many experts feared. Garman's body was finally recovered, and his team believed he tried to ascend in the wrong location. He was so weighed down and still situated so deep beneath the dark waters that his team could not recover him immediately. The medical examiner ruled his death one of the most nightmarish of outcomes: death by drowning. Alone in the darkness, with weight on top of him and pushing all around him, Garman succumbed to the water. The dive, meant to push the limits, instead served as a stark reminder of the importance of experience, proper planning, and respecting the ocean's dangers. Garman had a quiet burial, yet another victim to the unforgiving sea. He would not be the first, and he would certainly not be the last. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.